Okay, we've got 5 students. I'll just give it 1 or 2 more minutes.
Avgi,
Yeah.
can you also, when I mention it, would it be possible to just type in into the chat the assignment question for the apartheid, the one that's due on the 7th?
Of course.
Yeah.
Let me just copy it quickly.
You could do the whole thing. You could say after the one that starts with after participating in the Apartheid Museum.
Mm-hmm. Helena, shall we get everyone in? It's 1+2. Margot, you ready? We're going to let the students in. You guys ready?
Yep.
Okay, that is everyone for now. Rajesh, I'll hand it over to you.
Everyone's on?
Yes.
Hello, folks. Can you hear me? Welcome to Johannesburg, or at least virtual style. We are normally at our Johannesburg GBE at this time. Actually, the Sunday before the start of our GBE, we would be at the Apartheid Museum, seeking to understand the context that our micro entrepreneurs and those around them have lived through and continue to live through. Today, we're privileged to have the ability to go into the Apartheid Museum virtually with 2 expert guides leading us. My name is Rajesh Chandy. I'm along with my colleague Elias Papayoannou. It will be the 2 faculty members who will be with you throughout the week. The GBE team you will come to meet later on Monday, the 8th of February, has done a great deal of preparation for this as well as for the entire week. We'll tell you a lot more about that in the weeks to come. But today, it's about history and historical context and why history looms large and why you could not hope to possibly be of any use or help to your clients throughout the week without an understanding of the historical context of South Africa. And of course, apartheid, this awful, evil system, which was created by humans, represents not only a historical artifact, but its impact is visible in the lives and the livelihoods of the folks you will meet during our GBE. So that's the context in which that you want to keep in mind. Now we have a terrific group that'll take us through this session, and we're recording this as well, right, Avgi? Yes, we're recording this as well, so you can go and watch this again. Avgi, can you share the first assignment that's due on the 7th of February again, please?
Hi guys, I will just post the assignment in the chat as a reminder so you can all see it.
So this is the assignment. After participating in the Apartheid Museum virtual tour and conducting appropriate primary and secondary research, please submit a group reflection report on the following question. What are the primary ways in which the apartheid era history of South Africa likely affects the business lives of micro-entrepreneurs in Alexandria today? So that's the assignment that you will turn in by next Sunday. And that's why we're all here. Elias, let me hand things over to you before we go to Mdu and Joe.
So welcome to the virtual GB Johannesburg. Rajesh, I, Helene, Abhi, Lara, the team are all saddened not to be able to travel to South Africa, this beautiful country full of fantastic history and natural beauties. But the team has been working actually intensively to try to give us as much, as close as an experience as the one we would have experienced there. So I'm Elias, and along with Rajesh, we have been visiting South Africa for the past, I think, 6-7 years. Rajesh a bit more than me. And let me just say that I have been teaching at LBS since 2012, and the GB program is by far the most exciting week of my teaching life. And the visit to the Apartheid Museum, which we are doing every year, always is the pinnacle, the best experience of that. Because we cannot understand anything on that's happening to the micro-entrepreneurs that you will meet in 8 days, or anything, I would say, regarding big investment in Africa, if we do not understand Africa's past. And South Africa in particular has a phenomenal, very sad, and at the same time very intriguing history. And it is not only history, we don't necessarily, I'm sure that some of us may be interested about history, but actually history is present. If we are to walk in the streets of Alexandria, that we will try to do virtually, you feel the legacy actually in the daily interactions with the micro-entrepreneurs, the navigators, and everyone else that you would meet. And besides that, and since with Rajesh and the team who have been visiting this Apartheid Museum for the past 6 years, it also illustrates something that London Business School and the MBA program stand for, and this is leadership. So actually, one thing that hopefully will become apparent is how a group of very inspiring leaders, such as Nelson Mandela, such as Desmond Tutu, such as Frederick de Klerk, managed in a phenomenal, I would say, deal to convince their people for a peaceful transition of power in 1994. I don't want to go into the details because our two guides will give us a lot of these insights. But there is also a lot to learn about leadership from this fantastic country. So without further ado, let me pass to Avi and our great team of guides who are waiting in Johannesburg to guide us and explain us the complexities and the beauty of this museum.
Thank you, Elias. Hello, everyone. My name is Avi. I'm part of the Global Experiences team. You'll be hearing a lot from me for the next 2 weeks. Just to explain a bit more of how the tour today is going to run, we'll have two amazing guides with us, Joe and Mdu. Joe will walk us through the museum. However, she won't be able to hear or see any of your questions because she will be mobile and on the go. There will be some short dedicated Q&A breaks throughout the different, between the different museum chapters. That'll be every 15 minutes or so, where Mdu will be able to answer any of your questions. So please type those in the chat while you watch the tour, and Professor Rajesh will help moderate those during the Q&A breaks that we have. If we don't get through all the questions through those mini breaks, we'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the very end of the tour, so stay tuned. I would advise you all to stay on mute, and if for any reason you have any signal issues, feel free to also turn off your video while you watch and turn that back on when we get to the Q&A session. Make sure you pin the Apartheid Museum tour screen or your Zoom screen so you can have a bigger frame when you watch the video. And yeah, lastly, if we have any difficulties in streaming from any of the sites, we will be sharing a recording of this tour on Canvas, so you can always refer back to it when it's time for you to review it and fulfill your assignment. that's it from me for now. Without further ado, I will now pass it on to Jo. She will help us start the tour. So, Jo, over to you now.
Hi, everybody, from a very rainy Johannesburg. I'm going to go and start the tour. So I'm actually going to hand over to Mdu for now, and I will see you in a few minutes.
Okay.
You're going to be with me for the next couple of hours looking at apartheid, and we're going to be going through the museum. And the museum is, we're going to be doing the rise of apartheid, the apartheid period, and the end of apartheid. We're going to start with a quote, and this quote is by Nelson Mandela. "To be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others." Now, some of you will have been doing some reading about apartheid, some of you won't be, and there's no shame in not knowing anything. So we're going to start with a very basic couple of sentences on what apartheid is to begin with. So basically it was a system of segregation in South Africa from 1948 till the early 1990s, ending officially when our first democratic election happened on the 27th of April 1994. Now, this system of segregation was put in place to separate people, and this was done by using many, many different laws, each of them to separate people, but to give certain groups of people less. So the lighter your skin, the more rights you got; the darker your skin, the less rights you got. Now, the museum itself is a very interesting design. It's very brutal, it's very concrete, it's very powerful, mainly using the materials of concrete and a lot of red brick. This building was designed by Mashabane Rose, who are a local architectural firm that design many of our heritage sites and work on many of our heritage buildings. And it was designed in 2001. Now, if you were with us, you would be coming through the museum through a parking lot. And on the other side of this parking lot would be a roller coaster and an amusement park called Gold Reef City, which is very strange. So you may wonder, why is an apartheid museum in the car park? And the reason is, during apartheid, South Africa was a very conservative state, and we were not allowed to have casinos. So when apartheid finished, and we were allowed to have casinos in South Africa, if you wanted to open a casino, you had to put in place a number of ideas on how you could help tourism and how you could employ people. And the casino, what would become the casino, Gold Reef City, they said that if the government let them have a casino, they would actually pay for the Apartheid Museum, which I think cost about 80 million rand. And so that is why it is in this sort of quite strange place. But it's in the perfect place because it's between Johannesburg and Soweto, which is one of the largest townships in South Africa. Now, behind me, you've got these big pillars. Now, these are the pillars of the Constitution, and there are 7 of them. And what they say on the pillars is freedom, respect, responsibility, diversity, reconciliation, equality, and democracy. Now, during apartheid, we did not have rights, and we did not have a constitution. So post-1994, particularly in 94, 1995, a lot of work was put in South Africa in creating this constitution. And these are the principles of it. But just to say, our constitution is incredibly progressive. It has got many very important rights. Whether it is always stuck to is another question, but the fact that we have it is important. So this is the main entrance to the Apartheid Museum. And if you look above me, you're going to see 2 signs, and then in front of me 2 doors. So the one sign is white, and on the other side is non-whites. Now, if you had come to South Africa today, and if you'd come to the museum, you would have been given a ticket. And on this ticket, it would have said your race. So it would have said white or non-white, and this is randomly assigned. And this ticket would then affect which door you would go into. Now, what would happen during apartheid is that all South Africans would be classified into a race according to science, and this race would then affect everything that happened or everything you got in life. So this card that this represents would have been called a dorm pass or a passbook, and we're going to learn more about that in a minute. But basically, by being classified into a race, every aspect of your life would be affected by this. Where could you live? Which school could you go to? Who could you love? And we're going to learn more about this and this classification in a minute when we go inside. Now, I'm going to go into the white side, and you guys are going to go into the non-white side. So as you come into this space, you're going to see these cards all around us. And if you can take a look at some of them, you're going to see a photograph. On the card is going to be your race. Possibly it could be your culture, so whether you were Zulu or Swazi. It would say where you could live, where you could work. Now, if you were found outside of a specific area at a specific time, you could be arrested, and your crime would be the color of your skin. Now, this is very important because if you were arrested, you would end up in one of our prisons. And the South African prison system at this point, and still today, is very overcrowded, is very, very tough. But at this point, it was because the prisons were full of innocent South Africans whose only crime was the color of their skin. As we go through the museum, you're going to see, as time progresses, because it is chronological, this apartheid system is going to get more and more ridiculous and more terrible. And if we have a look here, we have something that's really, really bizarre. Now, when you were given a race, you actually were not, this did not mean that you were going to be that race for the rest of time. If you could make an argument that you were in fact another race, you would be decategorized and put in a new category. If you have a look at the photograph here, you can see a table with some men, a very integrated, diverse bunch of men, obviously, who you would go in front of, you would make an argument, and the sort of test that they would do would be something called a pencil test, where they'd actually put a pencil in your hair, and if the pencil stayed, perhaps you weren't white, and if it fell out, perhaps you were white because of what your hair was like. And they would reclassify you. The reason you would want to be reclassified is the lighter your skin, and the more rights you would get. So let's say you were black and you were quite pale and you could somehow make an argument. You would actually be reclassified to colored, which is a racial grouping that we have here. And that might mean that your kids could go to a better school, or that you could own a better property. Sometimes you were declassified or reclassified as down, meaning you go to a darker skinned race, which of course this all sounds ridiculous. And the reason that you would do that is, let's say you were colored, but you fell in love with a black person, they would actually reclassify you. So this system really affected South African life for decades and decades. And as we go through the museum, we're going to learn more about this. This space here is one of the most iconic spaces in the museum. You've got this ramp with these mirror boxes who feature people on top of them. Now, what this is this museum tells the story of Johannesburg and uses it as a symbol for the rest of South Africa. Now, for those of you who don't know, Johannesburg dates to 1886, when gold was discovered here. And that gold rush or boom town brought people in from all over the world and all over South Africa. And what they had in common was a need to make money and a need to mine gold. Now, if you have a look at these boxes, these are all contemporary people who somehow descend from early migrants into Johannesburg. And this shows you how diverse this early migration was.
Thank you, Joe, for a wonderful insight there. If there's any questions, guys, we would like to get on to them. Okay, then we will watch a 15 minutes documentary which sums up 2,500 years of South Africa.
In 1948, an election among the white citizens brought the National Party and its policy of apartheid to power, separating people by race, discriminating against blacks in every aspect of life. To Afrikaners, descendants of European settlers, this was the ultimate triumph of their history. As the new Prime Minister, D.F. Malan, proclaimed, "We hold this nationhood as our due, for it was given us by the architect of the universe." What did he mean? What path led across the land to this moment? This was the land of the baobab tree and the eland, where the people of the world had their beginning. Hunter-gatherers lived here some 25,000 years ago, ate the nuts and the berries of the veld, hunted the herds of antelope, moving over the plains as the seasons changed. Their spiritual healers had the power to dream, to be in the sky and to be under the water. They lived alone on this land without possessing it. They would become known as the Bushmen. "2,000 years ago, they painted the coming of the Khoi herders, driving their flocks of fat-tailed sheep onto the grazing lands. Soon after, Bantu-speaking farmers arrived from the north. They came with cattle and seed, millet and sorghum, brought iron hoes to till the ground and axes to cut back the woodland. They forged iron and gold taken from a land rich in minerals. They settled building walled towns. The Bushmen had the power to call the rain beast that walks on long legs across the land. The farmers asked them to call the rain to make their crops grow and for help with the tending of their cattle. But as the newcomers grew in number, they fought over the land. Soon the time of the hunter-gatherers was to end. Their spiritual healers painted what they saw, how white settlers would arrive and ride among them, firing muskets. The people would put arrows to their bows and fight, but their time was lost. They would become the people of the mist. In the mid-17th century, European settlers arrived at the Cape. They brought slaves captured from Madagascar, Indonesia, and other distant lands. They put them to work in market gardens and vineyards, used them to build their gabled homes, had them suckle and raise their children. On the isolated farms, slave owners slept in fear of their slaves, imposing their will through brutality and violence. In the town is Trinki of Madagascar, captured from her village as a child. Trinki was the fatal passion of her master. He forced himself on her. She had his child, and she killed it. Trinki would be kept in the castle dungeon. Her body left for the birds and rats to devour. Her master walked free. Trinki of Madagascar, only 25 years old. The story of Trinki is the story of black slave and white master that would echo down the generations to come. In 1806, the British seized the Cape Colony from the Dutch. By then, Dutch-speaking farmers, trek Boers, had reached Xhosa farmers, and frontier wars had broken out, lasting almost 100 years. The expulsion of Xhosa chieftains from their lands by the British and the Dutch, and a devastating drought led to the brutal Sixth Frontier War. Xhosa warriors attacked, killing Boer and British settlers. Maqoma, the commander of the Xhosa warriors, when asked why he was invading, replied, "I am a bushbuck because we are shot like them. We are no longer esteemed as chiefs." The British forces under Sir Harry Smith scorched Xhosa land, burning livestock and houses. When Xhosa chief Hintsa went to sue for peace, he was held hostage, shot, his body mutilated. After this betrayal, the Xhosa would never trust the British again. At the heart of the British settler community, a deep racism also took hold. The Boers decided to move north, away from British rule. They left, taking their servants and slaves with the Bible to guide them. Their leader, Piet Retief, gave as reasons the loss his people had suffered in the frontier wars and the British abolition of slavery. This exodus became known as the Great Trek. They would form their own
is that it can be quite loud in the museum, so there may be moments where you may struggle to hear me a little bit. Something that's important to understand, and you have watched this film by now, is that apartheid didn't just start one morning in 1948. It really did have a backstory. And that backstory starts when colonizers arrive in Africa in 1652. But we're going to jump forward quite a bit, and we're going to be in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so this is a map of Johannesburg in 1897. And just a little bit of a reminder for you that gold is discovered in 1886. So this is 11 years into this little mining camp. And why I'm showing you this map is that on this official government map, you really start to get a feel for what are the racial ideas already at this point. And so if you have a look over here, we've got quite a faint sort of triangle. Now this is the Johannesburg inner city. This is about 30 minutes from Alex or Alexandra where you're going to be working. And this is the original city. So this triangular part here is what we, from the very beginnings in the late 1800s, already would call the white city. So you have white residents living here, owning land. If you are not white, meaning black colored, which is a racial grouping here, Chinese, Indian, if you are in this part of the city, chances are you're working for a white person and you have permission to be there. Down this edge over here, these are the mines. Now, Johannesburg is a gold mining town, and the inner city, the original CBD, is literally built on the mines on the southern edge. But what's important for us today, and as I was saying, is about sort of the racial ideas at the time, is on this western edge here. This is very important because what the government basically did is if you were not seen as an ideal citizen, so either you were poor and white, because money always talked in Johannesburg, or more likely you weren't white, you would be pushed to the peripheries here. And if you have a look at this official 1897 government map, you already have very racist terminology on the map. So these are areas set aside for people who aren't white. This over here, an incredibly racist term for an Indian person. So I'm not going to use it, but to point it out, this over here. And if you have a look over here, now this word is the absolute worst word you can use in South Africa for a black person over here. So if you use that today in Johannesburg, you will probably go to court for a hate speech trial. But in 1897, that is on the map. So you can already see these racial ideas are really coming to the fore. But right now we're going to go back to Mdu for some questions.
Thank you, Joe, for explaining to us the early years of South Africa, which is about the map as well, which is very, oppressive. But however, I would really like to take the questions, immediate questions pertaining the introductory film, as well as the map itself. If there's any questions, Professor. Okay, we'll move along to the rise of the apartheid. It's whereby we'll get to see what actually propelled apartheid to life. However, it was brought forward in 1948, but these are the years prior to apartheid being elected here in South Africa. And yeah, we'll go back to Joe to tell us more about the rise of the apartheid.
So we are still tracing our pathway to apartheid. So right now we're in the early 1900s, and the museum is chronological. So in a short while we will get to 1948, but here we're early 1900s. Now, one of the things that was spoken about at the beginning of this tour is how does history relate to South Africa now? And I think this is really important. So in 1913, we start to see laws coming into place in South Africa that are segregationist laws, meaning they're laws put in place to separate people racially, but very importantly, the darker your skin, the less rights you were given. Now, these rights, these laws have had a huge impact on South Africa today. So in 1913, we have something called the 1913 Land Act come in, when the government at the time, which is not the apartheid government yet, it's a unified government between the Afrikaans and the British, they put a law in place that says they're going to give 8% of the land to black South Africans and 92% of the land to white South Africans. Now, if you have a look at this map here, it's actually very easy to understand. The black pieces of land, this is land given to black South Africans, and the white pieces of land are land given to white South Africans. Now, if you know anything about our racial statistics, this is actually an exact flip. So white people were given, who are the minority, were given the majority of land, and black people who are the majority were given the minority of land. And Sol Plaatje, who was a very well-known activist and writer, he famously wrote that he awoke to find himself a pariah in the land of his birth when this law was put into place. Now, why I say this is very important is a big issue we have in South Africa right now is there's a lot of talk about land expropriation without reciprocity. So taking land away from people who have it and not giving them any money for it. Now, this has been a constitutional court case. And this all comes back from this Land Act when the land was originally taken away from black South Africans. Also, in the early 1900s. So you can already really starting to see this idea of treating people who aren't white, giving them very much less than their white counterparts would have had. So another thing happening in this early 1900s period is, of course, the world is urbanizing. Johannesburg is urbanizing. Mines are starting. We've got industry. And you need a workforce. And in South Africa, you want black workforce because you can pay them less. So you guys are very involved in business, and it's a business school. And you're going to see throughout this tour, we're going to be talking a lot about industry and money, because I really feel apartheid was driven by money, and the end of it was driven by money. And so if you have a look here, we need a workforce. In Johannesburg, we need a workforce in the city. So the government imposes taxes on black South Africans living in rural areas. They have to pay tax. They aren't earning money up until this point, so they have to come into the cities to earn money. And they have to sign on to a migrant labor system where they are away for nearly the whole year. Maybe they come back home for 3 weeks a year if they're lucky. And when they get to the cities, they are put into these workers' compounds or hostels. So this top picture is the exterior of an older one. And this picture just further down, this is the interior of a migrant workers' hostel. Why this is important for you, because you're doing your research and your field work in Alex, is that Alexandra is very famous because it has hostels still functioning today. And so I want you to see the conditions in this space. And this is early 1900s, and of course now we're talking about 2021. And you know that all this is happening, these laws treating people badly, and so you actually need resistance. And in 1912, you've got the beginnings of resistance in South Africa when the ANC, or the African National Congress, is formed to start resisting the segregationist laws at the time. And so we're going to walk into the next area. And so we're still tracing this period of up towards apartheid. So we are not in 1948 yet, we're not in apartheid. But we're trying to see, why did this happen? And so we're in this small alcove here, and this alcove is about nationalism. So some of you may not know a lot about South Africa, but you may know something about German nationalism. So let's say you studied World War II at school. And if you look at World War II propaganda, Nazi propaganda, I should say, and the rise of nationalism in Germany, and you have a look at the images that the camera is capturing right now, you'll see a lot of similarities with Germany. So what is happening is, after the Boer War, which is between Britain and the Afrikaans people, and just to clear this up for you, when I'm saying Afrikaans, it's people who descended from the Dutch, who came into South Africa. It's both a culture and a language. Just to clear up, Afrikaans people are often blamed for apartheid and very much were the instigators, but I would like to just say that white South Africans in general supported or benefited off the system. Anyway, so after the Boer War, the Afrikaans people lose. They've lost thousands in the concentration camps that the British put here. They've lost their land. They are very embarrassed. And out of that comes this extreme nationalism. And it takes the form of looking back to another time, very much like German nationalism, dressing up in traditional clothing, doing traditional folk dancing, making propaganda films of a very important time. And all this is gaining support, along with a lot of fear-mongering, saying if you don't support us, and by us I mean the Nationalist Party, who would bring apartheid into place, then you are going to end up poor, you're going to end up white, you're going to end up penniless. And so this is a very important time in our country, because this is when you are gaining support for this nationalistic movement. You've got laws in place, you've got propaganda films, you've got fear-mongering, you've got a belief in eugenics and very dubious racial ideas. And so we're going to get to 1948 in a minute and apartheid, but first we're just going to take a bit of a break, and we're going to go to Mdu for a few more questions.
Okay, thank you once more again, Joe. We would like to take a moment and ask if there's any questions from the professor's side.
Uh, uh, yes, Ndu, and Joe, thank you very much. And to the students who are on, please do jump in. These breaks are designed for you to have a chance to ask questions, so that it's not only Ndu and Joe who do the talking. We'll give them a bit of a break as well. I have a question for you both. Now, as Joe, as you mentioned, um, Alexandra, if you go today, you can see the dormitories, people in some cases still living there. And if you talk to the locals, so for instance, our students are working with a number of micro entrepreneurs. Often they are first generation Alexandria residents. Often they moved from someplace, Limpopo, Eastern Cape, or another part, often those two locations, but other parts of South Africa as well. Can you possibly link the original history of employment related migration to the reality today, and what you see in today's post-apartheid South Africa around migration and life, why people move to Alexandria, for example?
Well, pertaining to that question, Professor, there is not much of people movement these days, simply because Alexander's settlement or rental, for instance, is not as cheap as it once was, simply because across, the road would be sent in. So the residents are quite aware that, many people would come and seek for places to stay in Alexander. So they are now charging quite exorbitant amount of money for those small rooms that are out for rental. So it's not much as it was before. People would come to mainly Alexander simply because it was affordable. They could stay in Alexander, knowing that they pay little just to have a roof over their head and also to go to work. But today, because of democracy and of course, times have changed, is no longer the same, Professor.
Okay, and Sandton, of course, for those who are not familiar with the geography of Johannesburg, this is where the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is located, one of the wealthiest places in all of Africa, which is right across from Alexandra, and it's a relatively new development by historical standards, at least, and therefore your point is it may not be. So people are moving to other locations when they do move in, rather than to Alexandria. Now, we do have, I was looking at the biographies of our entrepreneurs. A number of them do come from these locations, but your point may be that that may have been, 10 years ago or a little earlier, and that may be changed. Thank you. Other questions from anyone else?
So let me jump and pose a question, actually a clarification perhaps. Can you please elaborate on the concentration camps that were originally meant for the Afrikaans or for the Europeans, and then they were subsequently applied to the indigenous communities? Because I think this is something that most people are not aware. Can you please elaborate on this briefly?
Well, initially, and they were built for Afrikaner people. They were built by the British simply because the Afrikaners didn't want to give in. So they were purposely built to sort of incarcerate the Afrikaner nationalists so that they can obviously give back what the British were expecting. If there's no any other questions, we'll move over to Joe. Thank you.
So we've now reached 1948, and 1948 is an incredibly important year in South Africa because that is the official beginnings of apartheid, and it would only end in the early 1990s. So we've now reached apartheid, and this is the first cabinet of the first apartheid government who have been able to get enough support. But what is interesting is later on they would have a huge amount of support. But this first elections is interesting, very similar to Donald Trump's elections 5 years ago now, when he won certain constituencies but not the most amount of votes, that the Nationalist Party, who brought in apartheid, they won rural constituencies but not the major amount of votes, but that was enough to get them into power. So in 1948, the apartheid government comes into power and they bring this apartheid system in. But you're probably wondering right now, what is apartheid? And we're going to go and have a look over here. If we had a time machine, we'd take you back. We don't. And so what I will say is the best example of what apartheid is that I've ever seen is actually this wall, and it doesn't look like much. But if you come have a look here, you can see it's actually made up of many, many laws. I'll just read out a couple of random ones. Criminal Procedure Act, General Law Amendment Act, Group Areas Development Act, very famous. And basically apartheid was a system of laws, hundreds of laws, put in place over many, many years. Each law put in place to separate people racially, but to give certain people less opportunity, less land rights, less education. You couldn't even love who you wanted to love. You couldn't buy alcohol at certain places. Also very, very important, and this is very much related to what your research is going to be in Alexandra. Now, in Johannesburg, we have a couple of big townships, and townships were areas put aside for citizens who were not white. And the most famous township in Johannesburg is the one just behind me on the wall here. This is Soweto, or Southwestern Township, which is about 10 minutes from where the Apartheid Museum is. Now, why I'm talking about this is one of the major parts of apartheid is urban segregation, in that the apartheid government took spaces, separated people racially, and put them far, if you were not white, you were put far outside of cities. This is very important for your work because you're in Alex, which is a township. It's right near Sandton, which is the business center of Africa today, but it's not in Sandton. So it's a low socioeconomic area put aside for black South Africans. It predates apartheid, but really is cemented during the apartheid period. So this picture here, going back to Soweto, because it's a good example in the museum, this is a bunch of city planners and government officials, again, not very segregated, as you can see, it's older white men, coming up with a plan for Soweto. So if you have a look at this map, the names on the map, these are famous areas of Soweto: Orlando East, Orlando West, Meadowlands. And a major part of this is you could not have people of different races living within city centers. Firstly, because city centers are economic centers, and so money is being made. So that is a very important part of this. But you also can't have people of different races living together, realizing they're not so different, falling in love, being friends. So what you would do is you would rezone an area. Now, the picture behind me here, this is actually right where I live today. So this area is called Sophia Town. And Sophia Town was a mixed-race area right next to white areas in the 1950s. And the apartheid government put a law in place. They said people of different races cannot live in Sophia Town or areas like that. And they did a big forced removal, meaning they pitched up one morning they did give warning, I will say, pitched up one morning with their trucks like this, loaded people's things into the trucks, and took them to Meadowlands, which is in Soweto. And so that's really where you start to get this sort of like really urban racial planning, which we are still struggling with in South Africa today because we are an incredibly segregated country in terms of where people live. We're now going to move over here. And we've now hitting the 1950s. And we're going to walk through this small alcove here, and our camera is going to get some shots of what life was like in Johannesburg or South Africa in the 1950s. So I just want you to take notice of poverty, of slums. The images we're seeing here, a lot of these are actually Sophia Town, the area that was removed that I was just talking about. And then, very importantly, I mean, one of the major, I think, tragedies of apartheid is you couldn't love who you wanted to love. You couldn't marry who you wanted to marry. And these are great pictures. So this first picture over here, these are some government officials basically spying on a couple. The man was white and the woman was Indian, and trying to catch them in the act, I suppose, because their relationship was illegal. And if you have a look in the next image, this is actually the couple. So it's a doctor, Dr. Zarena Desai, with a professor, Professor Blacking, and their love was illegal. And that's the sort of real, I think the really sort of the emotional part of apartheid is that sort of law. Now, the 1950s are interesting, and if you guys understand American politics maybe, which you may know better than ours, you may know that in the 1950s in America, you really see peaceful resistance, very much influenced by Martin Luther King, by the civil rights movement. And to put South Africa into place, that is what's happening here. So under Mandela and many other leaders, I don't want to just say him, you get these amazing moments of peaceful resistance where people, instead of, they're not fighting, they're going to a square, they're handing over a memorandum, they're signing something. And I just picked out one to show you. So this first picture here, sorry to ask the camera to go back. This first picture here, this is in Soweto again. Now, Soweto was really the center of a lot of this resistance because it's a major township. In a square called Kliptown, normal South African people of all different ages, if you have a look here, there's children and women in the front here and men over there as well, all different people, got together and came up with something called the Freedom Charter. And the Freedom Charter was basically a document that people who opposed apartheid got together and said, we don't want to live by apartheid, so we're going to come up with a bit of an ideological document of the laws or the ideas that we want to live by. And the second picture here, you can see lots of tiny pieces of paper on here. So basically they sent scribes throughout the country to people who couldn't read and write and said, what should go on our charter? Normal people wrote these documents here, and it was put together, and the Freedom Charter was signed in 1955. And the most important part of the Freedom Charter is the people shall govern, which of course is completely against what apartheid said. But hopefully you've got some questions after all this, and we're going to go back to Mdu, and he can answer them for you and chat to you.
Okay, thanks, Joe, for the insight. And now we're going back to the questions. I would like to have those questions from you, Professor.
Yep. There are a few questions from the team. Question number one is from Alice, who says, what kind of government was in place before the nationalists came to power in 1948?
Okay, it was the government of segregation, which, however, laid a foundation of apartheid. They were oppressive, English-speaking government, it's safe to say, but not as pragmatic as the apartheid government was. Remember, the apartheid government came with a series of laws which ensured that people would adhere to. If not, they could obviously face the consequences.
And by pragmatic, you mean in implementing this series of laws that had to be adhered to? Is that what you mean?
Yes, sir. Yes, the laws were quite direct and, needed no any explanation.
Yes. Yeah. Alice, would you like to add to your question, or does that answer your question?
No, that answers it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Marlet, do you want to ask your question, please?
Sure.
So you briefly touched upon the German nationalistic movement, and it seems from the timeline that those happened at a similar time, like the more nationalistic movement in Germany and South Africa. Were there any kind of interactions or influences between these two, or did they kind of emerge independently of each other?
Yes, there was, how can I put this? There was similarities. There was same ideas that came about from the end of Second World War. If you can remember, in 1948, it was the end of Second World War, and in 1949, apartheid was enacted. So they were driven by the ideas that were brought forward by the Nazis. So they were quite influenced by the German strategy here in South Africa.
Thanks.
Thank you. I have a question. So, in this era, during apartheid, both in the period that we've looked at so far, as well as moving forward all the way till apartheid fell and democracy began, if a black person wanted to start a business in Johannesburg during apartheid, could they do so easily?
So I didn't quite follow, Professor. Please repeat that, okay?
So if I were a black person
Yes.
in Johannesburg,
Yes.
during apartheid,
Yes.
and I wanted to start a business,
Yes.
how difficult would that have been for me?
Okay, there were certain laws that were put in place. For instance, I come from a township called Katlehong. Then there are numerous streets. So in each and every street, you were allowed to have one spicer shop. That means a shop, a sole trader shop, where a person can sell to the community or to that people that live on that street goods. So you would obviously have to appear in front of the government personnel and disclose the amount of money that you have in order for them to reward you with a license of trading. So it really had to do with amount of money that you had.
Okay, and there were laws that prevented you, unless you had the license, from starting the business.
Yes, if you perhaps did the trading without the government's approval, it was an infringement, sir. You could not do that. You could be arrested because you had to appear in front of them first to be permitted.
And then today, a large number of those in townships are self-employed or small business owners. During apartheid, that was a rare thing. Is that right?
Yes. And if maybe I can put something which perhaps is not meant to fit in what we are talking about, but this is obviously what brings what is called xenophobia attacks, because the very same spicer shops that we are talking about in the townships are now owned by foreign nationalities simply because people do not have perhaps the money, because today it requires quite an exorbitant amount to start, an exorbitant capital to start or to continue with such businesses. So today it is difficult simply because of the value of money.
Thank you. Please continue.
We'll be ready for Joe now. We're going back to Joe.
So we've now reached 1960, and there are certain events in life that we wish they didn't happen because they're tragic and they're terrible, but those events are often the things in history that push us forward. And so we're at one of those moments, and that moment is called the Sharpeville Massacre. So in 1960 in South Africa, there's a peaceful protest where the Pan-African Congress, which is a political organization, are doing a peaceful protest, and they are protesting pass books, those books we talked about at the beginning of the tour. And the police opened fire on these people. This is about an hour from Johannesburg, and they shot 69 people, many of whom were shot in the back, and killed 69 people, actually shot more. And so this moment is a real turning point for South Africa, because we now, a lot of activists, and particularly a lot of religious people and a lot of white activists, say we're not going to get involved. And a lot of people that have believed in peace up until this point, meaning Mandela, the ANC, they say no longer are we going to do that, because these are the sort of pictures that they see. So this is a mass funeral of the 69 innocent people who were shot by the government in 1960 in South Africa. And this changes everything, and the ANC decide to become militant, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So what happens basically is the ANC and a number of other organizations say that they are no longer going to be peaceful, they're going to become militant, and they're going to fight. And what form does that take? So what we get to is the African National Congress, which is Mandela's party and the leading party of South Africa today, they decide to form an organization called Umkhonto weSizwe, which means Spear of the Nation. And Umkhonto weSizwe is a militant wing. Now the idea is, firstly, to put into context, we've got academics and lawyers and teachers and educated people who have no military training now going to become soldiers. So you have to put that in, you have to think about that first. But what is their plan? Their plan is not to go in and kill people. Their plan is not to blow up people. They're going to destabilize the government. They're going to blow up power lines. But with the idea that if you do that, you could always hurt someone, you could always kill someone. So they were very wary of it, but they had made this decision, this ideological decision, no more peace, now it's time to fight. And we get now, that was 1960, 1961 is this change. And we now get to 1963, because what happens is the African National Congress and the Communist Party, who were very big here, they are both gone underground. And they go underground to this house. Now this house is now, it's a National Heritage Site in South Africa. It's called Lily's Leaf Farm. It's right near Alex where you're doing your research. And they go underground here and they're planning this destabilization of the government. But in June or July 1963, the apartheid police raid Lily's Leaf. They find the who's who of the resistance movement in the garden, just over here at this thatched house on the top corner here. A laundry van rides in here, finds them here, and finds this who-who of resistance sitting at a table with the plans for this overthrowing of the government in front of them. And the evidence is there. So if you have a look over here, you've got everyone who was up for trial during this very famous trial that came out of that. Now, why I'm telling you about a trial in the middle of the Apartheid Museum is that if you look over here, you may recognize this man. So this is Nelson Mandela. And even though Nelson Mandela is not arrested at Lily's Leaf, he's already in jail for a minor offense. They find so much evidence in his handwriting sitting on the table and all around that they have him, and they have the who's who of resistance. And what they have them for is treason. And so we have a big trial in South Africa called the Rivonia trial. And the Rivonia trial, it's amazing that they weren't actually found guilty and executed. And so these guys are found guilty. They're put into Robben Island and other prisons for about 30 years. And you know, I'm sure many of you know all of you know Mandela was in jail, and this is the moment that puts him in jail. But it's very important because it also is the moment when we lose our leadership of the resistance. So in the mid-1960s, there's a vacuum for leadership. And in the next section, a little bit later, I'm going to tell you who steps in, but not just yet. this room is one of my favorite rooms. I love historic photography, and I think that often museums tell the story of the great people, but they don't tell the story of the everyday person, and I'm always interested in the everyday person. So firstly, this young man on the wall here, this is Ernest Cole. And Ernest Cole was a young photographer who in the 1960s did an incredibly brave thing in South Africa. He took photos of what life was like for a black South African in the 1960s. And without these photos, we wouldn't have such an amazing record. And Ernest Cole wrote a book called House of Bondage. And House of Bondage was banned here for many years. It's probably easier to get in London than it is here, although I know it's going back into print soon. And the next room of the museum is one of my favorites because it's the pages of House of Bondage just blown up really big. And so we're just going to take a few seconds to walk through this, and I want you to really think about what life was like for a black South African during this period, and really think about it economically, because you'll really see the difference. So this first image here, this is migrant workers coming to work in industry and on the mines, doing a health check. And this is so embarrassing. This is such a terrible way to come to work, be stripped, be searched. Awful. We've got more images of the mines, more images of the migrant labor system. We've got pictures of poverty, pictures of people being checked for their passbooks. So this image here, and I do apologize because this, I'll warn you now, this is a very disturbing image, but nothing was equal in South Africa, and obviously economically, education-wise, health-wise. And so if a black South African was sick and they had to go to the hospital, they definitely did not get the same treatment as a white South African. And if you have a look at this image, this poor baby who's sick here, and eventually this baby unfortunately did pass away, it says in the book. A major issue in South Africa today, one of our biggest issues, and I'm sure you'll talk about it when you're doing your research in Alex, is the disparity in education here. And education was really damaged during the apartheid period. So this image is in the 60s. It's of these kids, they're on the ground, they're sharing, they're all different ages, terrible conditions to be educated. A black child was, the government spent 10% of what they spent on a white child on a black child's education. And this image up at the top here, this little boy, look at him sweating and just trying to learn. Unfortunately, this, for many black South Africans, I think this is still the case, specifically in rural areas and in poorer townships. But we are now going to cross back over to Mdu to chat and to have some questions with you.
Thank you, Joe, for a very heartfelt, tour pertaining the life under apartheid in the 60s. Now I would like to have questions from you, Professor. I will follow your lead.
I don't have any at this stage. I'm happy to, if our students have questions, please jump in.
Okay. Well, there's a picture which is quite disturbing, the picture of miners that were, ordered by the personnel to strip naked and, expose their bodies so that they can be thoroughly, examined before they obtain jobs. In most cases, it was just to humiliate them, to make them feel less human, because in some instances, rather, you would find a father and a son in a very same line, lined up together naked, so that they can be scrutinized before they could attain jobs for themselves. So yeah, it was quite belittling and humiliating as well.
These were the diamond and platinum and gold mines. What were the mines that we were in question there?
No, sorry, the line was quite terrible.
So, just a question about the nature of the mining.
Yes.
Maybe you can clarify just what were these mines and just the context behind those awful images.
Okay. As far as the mines were concerned, I think this was the continuity of segregation policies, entrenched in mines. For instance, history has it that a salary of 10,000 white workers could have paid 70,000 of their black counterparts. So the gap was extremely insurmountable. The apartheid government continued from the foundation that was laid by the segregation government prior to apartheid. So the whole idea was to recruit African men. As young as 14 would be employed. So that was, of course, child labor taking place. So it was about, more work, less pay.
Thank you. Coral has a question. Coral, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, and sorry for not being able to turn on my webcam.
Okay.
But so I understand that most of the tension was within the, South Africa borders. But I'm just curious to know what happened. What was the rest of the world reaction to this situation, era, etc.
Well,
thank you.
Wonderful question there. Well, the world did try to intervene. If I remember vividly, India was one of the first few countries to boycott, trade with South Africa simply because of the atrocities that were taking place here in South Africa. And obviously, UK also played a very monumental role in bringing about sanctions to ensure that such atrocities do not, continue in South Africa. So the world was not relaxed. In fact, they were putting pressure, but apartheid government was just too hard-headed.
My first passport, which was an Indian passport, had a stamp that said valid for all countries except South Africa. And I remember thinking, oh, South Africa, I wonder what's in there. You're absolutely right. And I know that we will be discussing the international role later in the talk as well. Is that right?
Yes. Joe is in position now. We'll really have to go back to Joe. But at the end, we still have time for us to revisit some of the questions. Back to you, Joe.
As someone, I would call myself a social historian, and we all have periods of history that we love, and this is the moment that I really am very interested in, is the mid-60s onwards. Now, what happens is, as I said to you earlier, Mandela and the rest of the leadership of the ANC, they are in jail. I'm not saying there aren't some leaders around, but a lot of it is taken away. And that leaves a vacuum and a space, and what falls into that or comes out of that is very interesting. And that is the Black Power or the Black Consciousness movement. And the person who starts that movement is a man called Steve Biko. And of course, there's the movie with Denzel Washington, Cry Freedom, which is about this. And basically what happens is this young man from a university starts to write what it's like to be young and black in South Africa. Now that may not seem like much today, but in 1960s South Africa, that is huge. And his writings spread throughout the country and really mobilizes the youth. And so what Steve Biko is he's not a party, he's an ideology. He's a way of saying, let's change the way we think. Let's not lighten our skin. Let's not straighten our hair. Let's wear African clothing. Let's have our own clinics. Let's have our own shops. Let's support black business. And Steve Biko is the person who comes up with this. Now, for anyone who is very interested in this, I would suggest that you read I Write What I Like, which is Steve Biko's book. But Steve Biko is such a problem because he is educating the youth, he's mobilizing them, and that is a problem for the apartheid government. So in 1977, so a little bit later on, he is eventually murdered by the apartheid government. And the reason is given is he died after escaping from police custody. Now, on this wall that we're looking at, these are all people that died in police custody. So what happened is, in the mid-60s, around the time that Biko gets going, the apartheid government, as a reaction to resistance, they start to bring in new laws, and they bring in a law called Section 6. And Section 6 says that if you are arrested, you don't have to be charged, and you can be kept in prison or jail for 30 days, then 60 days, and eventually 540 days without being charged. And this law would last for decades into the 1980s. And about over 150 people were killed in our country during this period in jail, just through questioning and through torture. So that's one type of death. But this room we're in, this is just generally about death. So if you have a look above us, there are many, many nooses. And that's because we had political execution in South Africa until the late 1980s. And so many people who were caught being involved with resistance and resistance activities, and if they were sort of deemed bad enough, they would be executed. So as you get to this period, this is kind of called high apartheid. So in the 1960s, resistance is getting more as a reaction. The apartheid government is becoming more extreme as well. Now, these are not real prison cells. They are actually reimagined, but they are based on prison cells in downtown Johannesburg, in the prison, which is called Number 4 Prison at Constitution Hill. And this is about 1 meter, so 1 meter here, and I think it's about 2 meters or 2.5 meters. And this is where you'd end up in isolation. So at this point, we've now reached another one of those events that really propel us forward as a country, and not for good reason in many ways. So in 1976, we have a very famous event in South Africa called the June 16th Student Uprising. And what happens is, in Soweto, the students at the schools, and I'm talking kids probably between about 12 to 21 years old, older kids because the education system is so terrible, who protest. Now, what they are protesting is, and very influenced by Biko's ideology of just being able to think for yourself and be proud and be able to make the difference. These students, they protest because the apartheid government has implemented a law. And this law says that they're going to teach half the subjects in the South African schools in Afrikaans, in the black South African schools. So to put into context, we now have 11 official languages. But at this point, black South Africans, not many of them were speaking Afrikaans. So you go into a school and you tell kids who are an A+ student that they're going to learn maths and Afrikaans, and these kids were failing. And so very much sort of politicized by Biko and the ideology, these kids decide to protest on the 16th of June. And this protest is peaceful. It's in Soweto. And these kids just walk down a hill. They're going to hand over a document. But unfortunately, the police open fire. The first child killed, or the second child killed, is very famous, called Hector Peterson. And this lasts months, and hundreds of people are killed. It gets very, very messy, and really is a big impact in South Africa. Now, the vehicle that you are seeing on camera right now, this is what we in South Africa call a Casper. And a Casper is basically like a police tank. These are still used in South Africa today, but during the apartheid period, these would have been used in the townships extensively. And you can imagine the fear, because from the 1970s onwards, you really get the beginnings of a period of violent unrest, mass protest, youth protest, and this is in many ways the Casper vehicle. These are the police colors of South Africa. The Casper vehicle is the thing that represents the beginnings of violence. And we're now going to go over to Mdu for some more questions.
Thank you, Joe, once more again. So just by seeing those two, aspects. That would be the solitary confinement as well as the huge armored truck. I believe it will, bring questions to the students. But first, I would like to follow your lead, Professor.
Please continue. If anyone has questions, please either raise your hands or just type it in.
Pardon?
I think there are no questions, Mdu. Please continue.
Oh, okay. Just in short, Winnie Madikizela Mandela was solitary confined for 491 days. And what she had to say was simple. She said, I quote, "In order for me to remain sane inside a solitary confinement, I had to acknowledge an ant or a fly as a company." Those are the words spoken by the late Honorable Mama Africa, Winnie Madikizela Nelson Mandela. So we'll quickly revert back to Joe.
So we've now reached the 1980s, and if you had been with me at the museum, there's a fantastic film, but it's about 20 minutes long, so it really is too long to show you. But I just want to point you in the direction of YouTube, because that film is available. And it's, if you just search on YouTube, 1980s violence, South Africa, there's a film by HKU Libraries, and I would really suggest that you watch it. So now we're in the 1980s. And we're now towards we're taking the steps towards the end of apartheid. And we now have the rest of the world is starting to say, what are you doing, South Africa? You are crazy. The system is still in place. And so we start to get sanctions. We start to get trade embargoes. We really get mass protests in other parts of the world. People saying you can't do this anymore. Musical acts won't come play here. Sports teams won't come play here. And all this is putting pressure on South Africa. And very, very importantly, and why it would be great if you could watch the film, and I can send the link to your professors, is you can also start to see that the trade unions here get involved. The trade unions start to say, we are not going to put up with this. We're going to protest. We're going to stop industry. And of course, money talks. And that is really the sort of move towards the end of apartheid, this idea of industry being stopped. And when industry is stopped, things start to change. So how does that change come about? And we're going to get to that now. The parts of the museum that we're walking through here, we're not going to go into too much detail, but because this fight is becoming more extreme, you get a lot of very covert operations by the apartheid government. So the government is sending people into other parts of Africa. They're assassinating people. The government is putting bombs into buildings. And that's all this very violent 1980s period when we do actually have a state of emergency in South Africa.
The National Education Crisis Committee.
But
South African National Students Congress.
The pressure is now on. And the pressure is on financially. So in 1990, we have the big moment when our president, at the time, the last president of the Nationalist Party, who is a gentleman called F.W. de Klerk, he gets up in Parliament and he says, we're going to release Nelson Mandela, we're going to release a lot of the political prisoners, we're going to unban political parties, and we're going to sort of let the press have more freedom. And that is the moment that we know that apartheid is going to start coming to an end. And, you know, really I want to stress this is because of industry and trade unions at this point. But how do you end apartheid when the system has been going on for decades? What do you do? And so we're going to briefly look at what you do. What is the step to end apartheid? The picture that you're going past now, this is the picture, the next picture taken of the political prisoners that went to jail with Mandela, coming out of prison, old men. You know, many of them did not have many years ahead of them after they were released from prison. And so we've now got to this moment. It's 1990. We are going to, apartheid's going to end. But how do you end? You could have a big war, you could have a civil war, or you can try and do it peacefully. And so what South Africa does is we decide to have talks. And these talks are called CODESA. And CODESA are basically talks about talks. Anyone who's going to hand over power and anyone who's going to receive power, they come together and talk about this moment. Now what's very interesting is South Africa has got a lot of praise for this period because it was done through talks. But what I have to mention is the last 4 years of apartheid, that's 1990 to 1994, is the most violent period that South Africa has. And so in those last 4 years of apartheid, we have 14,000 South Africans killed in political violence. Guys, don't worry, you do you. It's fine. And so, who is fighting? What is this violence? And just to stress, guys, the museum is open today and everyone has a right to be here. So we are making our way around other clients. But what violence is this? And it's just to stress that it's either very right-wing white supremacist violence, so people who don't want to live under black rule, or it's black on black violence. So anyone who could be possibly getting power is now fighting amongst themselves. And so we have lots of looting, lots of shooting, bombs going off in Johannesburg, incredibly violent. And I was born in 1984, so and I think Mdu's was around the same time. And we both remember this. Now, there are wonderful films that we're not allowed to show here for rights reasons, but if you are interested, just go on YouTube and just sort of search the 1990s here with violence. And I know it's a very dark thing to search, but it's really worth trying to see what was happening. And if you love movies like I do, I would recommend watching The Bang Bang Club, which is a South African and Hollywood movie about this last 4 years of apartheid and how violent it got. Now behind me are weapons, and the reason it got so violent here is because people were fighting for power or not wanting to be under black rule, but also we had had decades of weapons coming into the country because there was an idea that we were going to have a civil war and people were going to have to fight. And so there were many, many weapons brought into the country at this period, and so there was a real surplus. But imagine we're in this very interesting period, and here we have 1993, Bishop Tutu watching Mandela and de Klerk, the last president of the Nationalist Party, or the Party of Apartheid, receiving their Nobel Peace Prize. This room is about CODESA, and we're not going to go into too much detail. These are the talks that I was talking about earlier about ending apartheid. But what I think is fun to show you is that the current president of South Africa is called Cyril Ramaphosa, and he's an ANC president. I think he has a very tough job right now with COVID, I will add. But this is a young Cyril Ramaphosa here, and he was the chief negotiator for the African National Congress during CODESA, during the talks to end apartheid. And the gentleman with him is Rolf Meyer, who was the chief negotiator of the Nationalist Party. And here they are talking about ending apartheid. Cyril Ramaphosa, interestingly enough, got his start as a trade unionist, which the trade unions are incredibly powerful here, and as a political activist. We're nearly at the end, but just before we get there, just to hand over to Mdu for a few more questions.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks a lot. So that just you have said that me and you, we can relate. Definitely that is true. I was also born in 1984. And around this period of time, it's when I was schooling, my primary school. So most of the things I can relate. But before I can continue with my talk, I would really like to find out if there's any questions from your side, Professor.
Yes, Marlet, please go ahead.
Yes, I'd be interested to hear, kind of, as apartheid regime went on for a very long time, how did the the feelings and the support within the population change for that for the government, and how did they react to all the violence going on in the country? Did that have an impact on the attitude towards the government?
A very good question there. Yes, the population, was starting to be despondent simply because of the lots and lots of killings that was occurring around the country. Even the white South Africans were now starting to be worried because this violence went, far as crippling the economy of the country. So indeed, they wanted the solution. And that's the reason why FW de Klerk, realized that what was best for the country was to release Nelson Mandela. And he promptly done so in 1990, not knowing that the West was yet to come, because now a on-black violence was awaiting, and easily sparked by, Zulu nationalists that actually wanted to be the head of the state. So that alone became enough reason why the fight should, continue in South Africa.
Koichi has a related question. Koichi, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So was there any conflicts among Black South African or kind of groups of Black people during or post the apartheid period? Or was they very cohesive?
So, sorry, sir, if you can repeat that again.
Sure. So was there any conflicts among Black South African, or they were very, cohesive?
Culprit in what way? Were they ever killed? Is that what you're asking?
Koichi, are you referring to sort of black-on-black violence or versus unity within the Black community? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yes, there were, and there still is culprits as far as the black-on-black violence is concerned. Does that answer your question, sir?
And just to build on that, I'm sure there are many reasons, and these are awful aspects of history. What is the assessment of what some of the cause were? You mentioned the Zulu uprisings. Of course, there were gangs involved. Can you talk a bit about sort of the roots of violence, especially in the immediately post-apartheid period?
I'm not sure whether I follow. I'm having difficulties with hearing the question properly. Please repeat, sir.
So the question, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. The question is, what were some of the causes behind this black-on-black violence?
To be quite honest, it's greed. It was greed, not wanting to let go of power. I think that's what caused the black-on-black violence during apartheid, because in Qatar, they benefited from the apartheid government. So they actually also wanted to benefit from the ANC, if not to be above the ANC.
Thank you. Josie, please go ahead.
Thanks. So I have a question around what's the main themes or the topics of the CODESA talks?
Pardon?
What's the main themes and topics of the CODESA talks?
Oh, okay. Basically, it entailed, transition. That was key point, as well as everyone should be equal before the law. Those were two major points of CODESA.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll quickly go back to Joe.
So we're now in 1994, which is a very, very important date in South Africa because it is the year of our first democratic elections. But just to give you a little quick rundown of what we've done so far, we've done the 1948 apartheid comes in, 1950s peaceful resistance, 1960s militant resistance, and a lot of our leaders are put in jail. Then comes the Black Power movement, the 1970s, the beginnings of youth protest, and the beginnings of mass protest. 1980s, the trade unions, the trade embargoes and sanctions, and now we've got to 1990, which is towards the end of apartheid. So on the 27th of April, 1994, we have our first democratic elections, which, just to give you a quick a few numbers, the ANC won 63% of that election. The Nationalist Party, who had been responsible for apartheid, still won 20, which I find worrying, and the Inkatha Freedom Party won 11. But I think what's so important here is have a look at these photos of voting. Because when you have never been able to vote, when you've never had an election where everyone could vote, you have fought to be here. So we've got images of de Klerk, our last nationalist president, and Mandela both voting. We've got long lines of people waiting for hours, waiting for kilometers, just to be able to vote. We've got Bishop Tutu voting. We've got normal, everyday South Africans who have really just been waiting for decades to be able to cast their vote. And of course, for a lot of people, this would be the only time that they would ever vote in a democratic election because of their age or because they weren't well. And so for me, those are like very heartfelt pictures of just being able to cast this vote. So in South Africa, even today, casting your vote, of course, is so important for a lot of people because of this. But just a little bit more about those elections. So just coming up here, we've got a picture of the original ballot paper. And just a fun story, a regular client of mine is the person who designed this. He was a young graphic designer, and this was his first job. And so you have on here our first ballots. So I think there were 18 parties running, if you have a look, many different parties. Now, there are 2 of these here. You may ask why, because actually they look exactly the same on the ballot papers. But I don't know if you can notice the bottom of the second party, one there. This is a fun little fact for everyone. There's an additional party because the Inkatha Freedom Party, or IFP, who I have already mentioned, it's a cultural Zulu party, and were involved in a lot of the violence at this point. They refused to run at first. And only later were they added, and someone had to come and stick on all the pieces of paper with some glue. So right till the end, you can really see there's a lot of issues, a lot of fighting. It wasn't just peaceful. But we eventually get to Mandela winning, the inauguration, an incredibly powerful moment in our country. Because we are no longer under apartheid rule, we've had a democratic elections. And so 1994 is the turning point. But I think now, and this really relates to what your lecturer was saying earlier, where are we today? Where were we then in 1994? How do you heal? How do you move forward? Because just like apartheid never came from nowhere and just didn't appear one morning in 1948, well, it didn't just go away. People's thoughts were still the same. People had lived in a certain way. And so South Africa has really had to do a lot of healing. And I'm not sure where we are. And I think we're probably, if you haven't already asked them, do some questions about this. You may ask some questions now. And I don't know if I'm going to have a good enough answer for you. But how do you heal from decades of hurt, from decades of economic inequality? And, I don't have an answer. But one way we did it was we decided in South Africa to not have straight out criminal trials. So what we decided to do was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we are very well known for this. Now, if anyone has done any work legally or in Rwanda has something quite similar, of course, in their trials. And that we decided to have a commission in 1995 where thousands of people asked to take part in this, where either you would be telling your story, what happened to you, an atrocity that happened to you, a human rights atrocity, or you could ask for forgiveness and tell the truth about what you did. And these trials happen throughout the country, or this commission, let's not call it a trial, this commission happened throughout the country. Thousands of people were seen, very emotional. And if you were found to be really sorry and really asking for forgiveness, then you would actually be granted amnesty. If they felt that you weren't real, then you could go forward into a criminal trial. It's been seen as something very successful on one level, so don't let me telling what I'm about to tell you dampen that. But there was a lot of discussion afterwards that, especially from people like Steve Biko's family, who was murdered, to say, but, you know, there's a lot of forgiveness and that's wonderful, but what about the people who did terrible things, who aren't sorry, who shouldn't have got amnesty, who should have been punished? And so that has been a major issue with TRC. What I will say is we are about to enter new trials now, which are criminal trials that have come off this. And if anyone has any questions about this or anything else, in a few moments I will be able to answer that for you. But just to remember, this was our way of trying to heal. But we're now going to hand over to Mdu to answer some questions. Okay, yeah, sure.
Thanks a lot once more again. We're now being joined by Joe. It was a wonderful tour indeed.
Thank you.
And just to give a bit of a clarity as far as the 90s violence was concerned, it was two big black political parties that locked horns. It was the ANC in favor of Nelson Mandela and IFP in favor of Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi. What actually happened was Inkatha obviously wanted the chief to be the head of the state, which was unconstitutional. So that alone, left numerous people's lives taken, and I don't know if you would obviously like to add, but talking from the township perspective, it was never an easy years to grow up in, simply because the Inkatha supporters, which mainly was the Zulu nationalists, I'm a Zulu by the way, they lived in the hostels, whilst the ANC supporters were found in the township houses. They were the township dwellers, but it was a proximity of the hostels and the township houses, and obviously the killing would take place, especially at night. The Inkatha would just walk into the township houses and start to massacre people, including children, and that alone was a reason why Winnie Madikizela Mandela and many other ANC supporters, Umkhonto weSizwe to be exact, would obviously, try to raise funds to, provide arms for the township dwellers. And indeed, it happened because each house, I remember vividly, there would be, leaders, township leaders that would come in door to door, house by house, to ask for the little that you have, it would be a range between 5 rand or 2 rand, and that money was raised, purposely to buy arms to protect themselves from, the Inkatha Freedom Party. The reason why they've done so was because the government itself fueled this violence between the two biggest black political parties in South Africa, because the government knew exactly that they were not going to win the elections of the 1994. So why care? It worked in their favor because now blacks are at each other's throats. And obviously, many of the people were left dead, especially in the townships. But nevertheless, ANC, of course, obtained about 63% of the elections, and Inkatha obtained about 11%. It could have been more if they didn't decide to join in on 11th hour.
Yeah, really, the 11th hour.
So that's actually what cost them their loss. And yeah, I would just also like Joe to add from the urban perspective.
Yeah. So I would obviously have had a very, very different perspective to Mdu, because I came from a white family, suburbs, privileged. And my experience with this time is coming from quite a liberal family, is talking about it a lot and debating it a lot, but really my view was the news. I was not seeing it firsthand like you, for sure. I was seeing it through a news broadcast on our government broadcasting station. So very different viewpoints, I think.
Yes. Not to mention the necklacing of people that happened almost daily, which was very, very traumatizing experience to come across. And probably one of the reasons why crimes are perpetual, mostly in the townships, because of what actually happened. It was an era where people's lives did not matter. A person could be easily killed during the multitude of people. And for instance, some of us were still young by then. I think I was about 8 years. It ended when I was about 14. So yeah, those years were very terrible years. And most of the people, especially the ones that were foot soldiers, if I may say, many of them were never rehabilitated. They were never, get to be taken to counseling to deal with their post-traumatic disorders. So that alone also is one of the causes of, crimes taking place. So now if there would be any questions from your side, guys, I'm with Joe now. Sure. I think we're going to make quite a great team.
Yes, thank you indeed, Mdu and Joe. That was wonderful. It's one thing to be there. When we're there physically, we tend to linger in certain areas and less in others. And what you've done is given us this wonderfully holistic picture. Even though I've been going to the Apartheid Museum for the last 10 years, I've probably been there about 15 times or so already, you gave a very unique perspective to this in this overview. For me, one of the areas where I tend to linger, because I find it just so scary, is this part where it's DF Malan, the former Prime Minister, and HF Vervoort at political rallies, talking about the logic behind apartheid. And of course, DF Malan was the architect in many ways. The foundations of apartheid were laid during his time. And it just, what they say, which is really about fear of the other, was in a horrible way. It just makes it so reasonable. That's what is scary. It just seems so reasonable about why we need to be separate, or why there is no other way, and that we have nothing against anybody. It's just the way it is, So lots and lots to consider every time we go there. I do have a question before we please those others on the call, please join in. I do have a question. The other part where I sometimes linger at the museum is the part about the boycotts that happened in the late 80s and 90s, and the role of corporations, especially multinational corporations, in that. Can you talk a bit about that? Not necessarily at the national level, but also companies saying we will not do business, or they're saying we will do business, and what implications that have.
Yeah, I mean, I probably should have mentioned, was supposed to mention it. When you're doing this live, you forget a few things. But I think, can I go back to your first statement just for a minute, which was about sort of this idea of trying to justify apartheid? And sorry, just to change tact for 1 minute. But there's a video we would normally show, and I think that's probably what you were talking about. And because we couldn't show it, maybe just to say that for Wut, who's like the architect of apartheid, what he says in the video, and I don't know if you spoke about this, but he says that apartheid is a policy of good neighborliness. And I think that's probably kind of what you're talking about, is it's really, these guys were spin doctors, and they could, they could sell anything to anyone, I suppose. And in this case, they're selling a really terrible racist ideology to everybody. And then going back to this idea of business and corporations, in the 1980s, as I would really recommend going to watch that film on YouTube, and I will send you the link if you'd like, so you can really get an idea. But there's a lot of violence. Firstly, there's the pressure from the rest of the world saying, don't trade with these people. But then there's actually this physical fear of violence, because there are bombs going off. It is dangerous. It's unpopular to be here. It's unpopular to trade with us. And so you get a lot of international businesses disinvesting out of South Africa and completely leaving the country. And of course, I mean, again, there's this idea that money speaks, because business people aren't trading with us, because they are not going to even have offices here anymore. And this had really, Johannesburg specifically had been this real center of business for Africa and for gold and for minerals. And suddenly people are leaving, particularly downtown Johannesburg. Entire huge businesses are just picking up and leaving the country. You can imagine the fear and the impact that had on South Africa. So hopefully that answers the question a little bit.
Thank you very much.
Sorry,
sorry, please.
Sorry, just to add, for instance, we've got Pick n Pays here in South Africa, which are now erected in the townships. But back then, it was an all-white supermarket, where you find that in the township, it's only Checkers, So it was Checkers back then, but not as Checkers as it is today. But back then, it was a low level of market that could be found in the townships. And secondly, KFC was never found in the townships. It was found in the white community until early 90s, when one of our highly respectable, he was an actor and a drama activist. He passed on, Joe Mafela. He was representing, a black version of KFC in the townships back then, called Chikilikin. And that's when black moguls came about, black people becoming, prominent in business sector. It was late 80s, moving towards the 90s.
Thank you. I'm aware that we only have about 5 minutes left, and we have a few questions. Let's say, Kadir, you haven't had a chance to ask questions yet, so please let me point to you, please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Prof. Considering that this is super recent, I'm really curious about how life is right now in South Africa. So the apartheid ended like 17 years ago, more or less, or no, 2027, right? So how people like relate nowadays? How like Mdu has just talked about this restaurant that have opened in different areas, but I'm wondering if the people live mixed right now, or they are still like kind of segregated in different neighborhoods. How is the daily life in South Africa, because unfortunately we couldn't have the chance to visit the country. But just if they can give us like a small, like a briefing of how is the day there, how do you feel in terms of the mixture of races, right?
So I'm going to start, but I think it's important to say that I think it really would, I think it's nice to have both of us here, because not even just because of our races, I think just different people will answer this differently. I think I'm quite a cynic. I think South Africa is still, not by law, but still quite segregated on some levels. And why I think this is, a lot of my clients, because when I'm working as a guide, they all say they'll go into a restaurant in Sandton, which is the sort of business district near Alexandra where you're working, and everyone's sitting as white and everyone's serving as black. That's their comment, not mine. So I think on some ways we are still segregated. Where I work, I run a business downtown in the original inner city, which is very integrated. So in that case, I think is a very integrated space. But I think it takes, it's only what, 17 years or whatever, and it takes a long time to change. I think we're trying, and I think hope is a wonderful thing. I think it's the most important thing. But I mean, I also just will say before Mdu jumps in, and he may have a different perspective to me completely, which I would love. I think COVID, just in general, has had a very bad impact on South Africa economically and everything. So we're really not in the best space right now because of that. But let's hope things can get better. But your answer now.
Well, in a nutshell, yes, I totally agree with you. But it's a question of education mostly, simply because, my generation was the generation that started to receive, was the first generation to receive education, which was getting to be better. And you get today's generation, opportunities are quite, unlimited. In that way, they get to experience other races around tertiary, around secondary level of their schooling. For instance, I was born in Katlehong, grew up in Katlehong. My education was all black schools throughout my secondary. I started to interact with different races in the higher level of education. So today things have changed. So we're slowly getting there. As far as settlement and housing is concerned, it's a question of wealth, which there's still a lack of economical emancipation, if I may call it that way. But we're quite optimistic. We're getting there.
Thank you for your answers.
That's very helpful. And Kadira, that's a question I'm sure we will keep asking, or many of the folks we will interact with in South Africa, and it's a terribly important question. They say history never repeats itself, but it does often rhyme. And so what happens in South Africa has implications for all of us. And so we will ask, especially, please ask that question if you could, to each of the speakers we have throughout the week. So Mamelo, for instance, who's a graduate of London Business School 2011 MBA, who's one of the top executives at the largest Vodacom, the South African affiliate of Vodafone. She's there, and she'll describe her story and how that's changed. And we'll hear from several others, not least the micro entrepreneurs who you will come to know very well throughout this next week. I see that we're at the end of our hour. I also see that we had some questions. Can I request, Abgi, can we take these questions in the sessions to come, so that we can finish more or less on time? For now, let me just say thank you so very much. Thank you, Mdu. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Margot, who's been behind the scenes. We haven't seen you yet, so hopefully we will. We've been orchestrating this whole thing for us from all this way. And you've been working with us for about 10 years now. So, Margot, thank you also. I will, let me hand things over to Avgi to wrap up.
Thank you, Rajesh. Thank you, team. It's been a fantastic work from all of you. Thank you so much for this. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to share those in the chat. Du and Joe are very happy to answer those over email, and I can share them with you. So if anything else pops up later today while you reflect on your experience, feel free to email me and I'll get those to you. I will also share with you any links, books or videos Joe mentioned during her talk. So those resources will be shared either on Canvas or in your next newsletter, so keep an eye out. Yeah, that's all from me. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you, Du. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, tech team. Amazing effort.
Thank you, Mark. Good to see you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And team, as you prepare for your assignment, please feel free to reach out to Elias and me as well. Elias is an expert on the history of Africa and its implications for the world today. I've been working in the area as well, so please reach out. See you later. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
There you go.
Thank you.
Abgi, I see Alex's question, and this would be a good one also for Nick Binatel. Can you take note of that? And we can call on her separately as well.
Absolutely.
And the video I sent is the one by the former Prime Minister, which is a bloody scary one, justifying apartheid.
Whew.
Okay, I've also sent you some emails.
Yes, I saw.
Yeah, and I have one more. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. I've just posted one more question. So, Abgi, thank you. So, yeah.
Thank you, Koichi. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
See you very soon.
Koichi, this is a great one to ask Mamelo, our opening speaker, because she runs a huge organization.
Wow.
As an employer as well. So and you know she can tell you from personal experience as well. So please do ask her that question too.
That's great. Yeah, thanks so much.
Sure.
Yeah, so see you soon.
All right, bye.
Okay, I think this is just us then.
Larissa, that's my wife.
All right.
I said she could join. She's downstairs watching separately. There she is. She's gone. Who's jury?
Part of the tech team.
Okay. It felt like Du could not hear us, eh? Sometimes.
Yes, I think it's because when we're doing the rehearsals, it was so loud because, remember how those videos from everywhere are interfering. So I couldn't hear him at all. So I think Margot and the team tried to put some blankets on top of the speakers circulating Du and Joe in that corner. And it was actually the quietest corners we could find in the museum. So yeah.
No, that's fine. It worked out. It worked out.
Yeah.
Any other reflections?
What was your reflections? I really, really, really enjoyed it. I think I was thinking it's the first time in like 3 years that I'm actually able to grasp so much more information from the museum instead of like rushing students around and making sure that nobody's left behind and we're starting the session on time. So I could just actually follow the storyline and.
This is very true. This is very true. It's actually efficient too. Right. Yeah.
I think the starter video could have probably used some subtitles, but other than that.
What of the video? Yeah, that's always the case. You're right.
Yeah.
Were there subtitles? There were. I don't remember that.
I can't remember it.
It's a hard one to follow, even in live. Yeah, even in person.
Yeah, it's true. I remember. But yeah, I thought it was great. And the questions picked up at the end, which I...
Yeah, and hopefully there'll be more. Du was a bit quiet. Maybe he was a bit nervous. I don't know.
Yeah. It was good. I think it'll be interesting to find out more about this question about what is South Africa like now, or how did the transition work?
Well, which is the whole point of, part of the point of the whole week is to understand the present.